The Alaskan wilderness is vast, desolate, and deeply indifferent to human life. What you are about to hear are 3 true Alaskan horror stories inspired by real events. We'll hear from a pair of hikers, a lone winter guard, and 3 men who were hopelessly stranded. First, a young woman's belief in a terrifying local legend is the only thing that stands between her and a friend who walks into a fog, following the sound of a crying child. Next, a grieving guard at a remote pumping station is pushed to the edge of sanity when a knock on his impenetrable door begins to tap out a secret code only his deceased daughter would know. Finally, 3 men find shelter from a blizzard in a remote cabin, but soon uncover the grotesque and unspeakable truth about the meal their host has been serving them. The greatest terrors aren't found in the darkness of the woods, but in the choices we make and the kindness of strangers. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming for you next. Matthew and Lisa were friends. They went to different schools. He was studying engineering, she was a history major. But they'd met at a trivia night at a local bar and hit it off. He was the practical one who trusted logic and numbers. She was the one who got interested in the stories behind things. They were at that point in their lives, about to graduate, where the real world was waiting. So they decided to have one last big adventure before starting their adult lives, and they picked a hiking trip in Alaska. It was here that their different ways of seeing the world would be a problem. In the weeks before they left, Lisa had gotten deep into the local folklore. One story stuck with her, about a creature called the Kushtaka. The legend said it was a shapeshifter that would mimic the sound of a crying child to draw lost hikers off the trail until they were never seen again. When she told Matthew about it, he just shook his head and laughed. He wasn't worried about campfire stories. Their hike was on the Crow Pass Trail, a narrow path that cuts right through the Chugach Mountains. It was late afternoon, around 7 o'clock, and the sun was starting to dip behind the peaks. Even though it was spring, it was cold up in the mountains. You could still see patches of old, dirty snow in the shadows off the trail. They were dressed for it, of course, in full winter gear, but the chill was starting to bite. For most of the day, the air had been clear, and the only sounds were their boots on the trail and the distant, steady roar of a waterfall. It was peaceful. But as it started to get dark, the weather turned fast. A fog began to pour down from the mountain peaks. This wasn't the kind of light fog you see in the morning. This stuff was thick, heavy, and wet. It felt like walking into a cold cloud. Within minutes, you couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The constant sound of the waterfall just vanished, completely muffled. The world went absolutely silent. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, like someone had thrown a heavy, wet blanket over the entire valley. Matthew didn't seem too bothered at first. He pulled out his new GPS, confident it would sort them out. He switched it on and waited. He just stood there staring at the screen, and you could see the frustration building on his face. The screen was lit up, but the map was just a blank, gray void with a single blinking dot in the middle. The one piece of gear he was counting on had completely failed. That's when the mood really shifted. Now there was just a tense, frustrated silence as they both realized how serious their situation was. Then, a sound cut through that dead quiet. It was a cry, a high-pitched, thin wail. It was, without a doubt, the sound of a little girl crying for help. It was faint, echoing from somewhere out in the grayness. Matthew's head snapped up. His frustration was instantly replaced with a sense of purpose. "You hear that?" he said, his voice low. "There's a kid out here. She's lost." He immediately started to move toward the sound, ready to solve a real problem. But Lisa didn't move. She just froze right there on the trail. She said it felt like all the blood in her body turned to ice. It had nothing to do with the cold air. The sound was just too perfect. It was the exact cry you'd hear in a movie. So desperate, so helpless. It felt like a trap. The stories she'd read about the Kushtaka came rushing back into her head. The crying child was its signature trick. "Matthew, no," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please don't. That's what the stories say. It's a trick." He just looked at her, and she could see he was already annoyed. "Lisa, that is a child," he said, like he was explaining something very simple. "A real child. I'm not going to just stand here and do nothing." His mind was made up. Her fears were just stories. The crying was real. "I'm going after the sound. The GPS still has our coordinates locked for this spot. I can find my way back here." The crying came again, a little louder this time, a little more urgent. It felt like it was impatient. "You're going to get lost," Lisa pleaded, grabbing his arm. His jacket felt cold and damp. "If it's a real person, they can make their way to the trail. We should stay here, where it's safe." She was terrified of the folklore, but she was also getting angry. Her fear felt real, and Matthew was just dismissing it like she was a child. He was being a stubborn, heroic fool, and he wasn't listening. He pulled his arm away from her, his face set. He was frustrated, but he was also completely sure he was doing the right thing. He gave her one last look, then turned and walked right into the wall of fog. She watched his outline get softer and then disappear completely. She could hear his footsteps on the wet ground for a few seconds, a crunch, then another, then nothing. The fog had swallowed him whole. She was completely alone. The only sound in the world was her own ragged breathing and the blood pounding in her ears. She stood there for what felt like an hour, just listening to the silence. And then, she heard the crying again. It was closer now, so close. It sounded so real, so full of pain. For a terrifying second, she wondered if she had made a horrible mistake. Just then, the fog in front of her seemed to thin out, and a small, dark shape stumbled into view. It was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Her jacket was soaked, her face was smeared with dirt and tears, and her teeth were chattering from the cold. She wasn't a monster. She wasn't a trick. She was real. Every fear Lisa had, every dark legend she had believed, it was all wrong. She had let her fear stop her from helping, and she had been completely, terribly wrong. The feeling was so overwhelming her legs just gave out, and she sank to her knees on the wet trail. The little girl just stood there, looking at her with wide, terrified eyes. Lisa realized she had been right that there was danger out here, but she had been wrong about what it was. She got to her feet, took the girl's small, cold hand, and started walking down the main trail, away from where Matthew had disappeared. They didn't talk. After about a mile of walking in that heavy silence, they saw flashlights cutting through the fog ahead. It was a search party. Their faces were tense with worry, but they broke into relieved smiles when they saw the little girl. One of them knelt down and wrapped her in a thick blanket. "We've been looking for you for hours," he said to her gently. Then he looked up at Lisa. "Who are you? Are you all right?" Lisa could barely get the words out. "My friend, the guy I was hiking with. He went looking for her too," she said, pointing back into the thick fog. "He heard her crying and went in that way, about an hour ago." The relief on the rescuer's face vanished. He exchanged a grim look with the others. He stood up, pulled out his radio, and his voice was flat and professional. "Be advised, we have located the missing child. She is safe. We have also made contact with an adult female hiker who reports a missing male. He left the trail an hour ago, heading northwest from these coordinates. We are switching from a rescue to a search. We're going to need more teams, and we're going to need them now." They started a new search that night, and it went on for days, then weeks, but they never found a single trace of Matthew. No footprint, no piece of clothing, nothing. It was like the wilderness just opened up and swallowed him. Lisa brought one person out of the fog that day, but the wilderness kept the other. And the worst part, the part that probably still keeps her up at night, is knowing that her fear, the thing Matthew laughed at, is the only reason she isn't on that list of the missing too. In the brutal chill of February 1987, the silence at Pumping Station 11 in the remote Alaskan wilderness was absolute. Its world was defined by a deep and constant drone. It was more a feeling than a sound, a low, steady vibration from the pipeline that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the frozen earth, the mechanical heartbeat of the wild. For 30 years, this was the only companion George Gus Peterson needed. His life was a fortress of routine, built to keep the past from closing in. Mornings were a ritual of slow stretches to work the stiffness from his old joints, followed by a mile-long security walk around the perimeter. A solitary march through the biting wind and vast, empty snow. The instructions for the job had been simple, given to him decades ago. Keep the gauges in the green, report any leaks, and the most serious rule, the one they repeated until it was burned into his memory: never open the door, never let anyone in. For any reason, never open the door. The rest of his day was spent with the ghosts of his family. He'd been on shift here when the earthquake hit their town, a 7.1 that had flattened their small house in seconds. He only survived because he was at work. The guilt was a physical weight. His only comfort was at his small desk, working on a children's book he'd started with his daughter, Sarah. He would write the words, and she would draw the pictures, her tongue stuck out in concentration. It was good. Quiet time. Just the two of them. He knew every normal sound of the station, every creak and groan of the metal as it settled in the intense cold. These were the sounds of his world, until a new sound arrived on a Tuesday night. It was faint from the direction of the heavy outer door. Thump, thump, thump. Gus, half asleep, dismissed it as a chunk of ice falling from the roof, but a minute later it came again, and this time he sat up. It sounded like a knock, but that was impossible. The thought was so absurd he almost dismissed it completely. A trick of the wind, he decided, nothing more. The next night it came again. Thump, thump, thump. Slower this time, more deliberate. He didn't jump, he just listened, a feeling of annoyance mixing with a cold knot of curiosity in his stomach. He was sure of it now. That was no ice. That was a knock. His routine the next day was the same but different. A new tension had settled over the station. Every creak of the metal, every gust of wind against the walls, now made him pause. He was listening. He was waiting. He stopped working on the book. The happy memories were a distraction he couldn't afford. His focus was entirely on the door. The knocking became unpredictable. Sometimes it was slow and patient. Other times it was a frantic, desperate drumming. He tried the radio, but the speaker returned only a roar of static. He did a full check of the gauges, his hands tracing the familiar pipes and dials, hoping for a mechanical fault. But everything was normal. The pumping station was built like a fortress. Past the main hall was another heavy steel door, and past that, a third, before the final thick metal door to the outside. No sound should have been able to get through. But one night he heard it. A dry scraping sound, like sandpaper on stone, whispered from the direction of the main entrance. It was low and raspy, and it sounded impossibly close. His mind, starved for information and sleep, began to crack. The sound on the door began to morph. It was the frantic beating of his own heart. And then, it became the sound of a small hand, insistent and loving, tapping out the secret code he and Sarah used to share on his office door. It was a cruel trick, his own grief being used as a weapon, tempting him to break the one vow he had to keep. He spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended terror. He saw flickers of movement in the corners of his eyes. He smelled something sweet and wrong, like something rotting beneath a thin layer of wintergreen. The whisper came again, calling his name. The drumming intensified. It was a violent chorus. Louder now. Desperate. It was in the walls. It was in his head. A scream caught in his throat. He pressed his hands to his ears. And then, a click. Loud, jarring, final. It was the sound of the main lock on the outer door turning. Gus froze. His blood ran cold. The rule had been broken. The door swung open, and the freezing air rushed in. It was his manager, holding a briefcase. He took one look at Gus, gaunt and wild-eyed, and a look of confusion crossed his face. "Gus, what the hell happened to you?" Gus could only stare at the open door, the door that should never be opened, and at the fresh, undisturbed snow outside that showed no sign of footprints. The manager, oblivious, just shrugged and pulled the heavy door shut. "Damn, Gus," the manager said, his breath fogging in the cold air. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Gus stared at the closed door, his mind trapped in a terrifying loop. He would never know. Was it his grief, finally consuming him and twisting reality? Or was there really something out there in the endless night? Something that knew his daughter's secret code? How many of the ghosts that haunt us are real? And how many are just our own sorrows, knocking at the door, begging to be let in? The cold came first. It wasn't the kind of cold that just nips at your ears. It was the deep, heavy cold of the Alaskan bush, a gnawing weight that got down into your bones and stayed there. Then came the snow. Out on the vast, frozen surface of Lake Clark, the world for 3 men in a dead boat had shrunk to a prison of ice and wind. Frank, Gunnar, and Cody were stranded. The shear pin on their motor had snapped, and 100 miles of unforgiving wilderness stood between them and safety. Through the swirling snow, Gunnar, a bush pilot who knew the land, spotted their only hope, a trapper's cabin on the distant shore. Hours later, they stumbled inside, half frozen and expecting a ruin. Instead, they found a warm, tidy space and a girl, no older than 17, who looked up from the wood stove with a tired smile. She said her name was Anna. She explained that her parents, seasoned homesteaders, had gone for supplies weeks ago and had been caught by the early storm. She was alone, but she was okay. She offered them the floor and, to their immense gratitude, a bowl of hot stew. The first night felt like a miracle. The stew was rich and savory, chasing the cold from their bones. The cabin was a bubble of warmth and light against the howling storm. Anna ate alongside them, a look of genuine satisfaction on her face. "My mother's recipe," she said quietly. "It's good to share it." The 3 men, who had been facing death hours earlier, felt a profound, bone-deep gratitude. The next morning, the storm was still raging. They were stuck for another day. A strange, homely routine began to form. Gunnar, the pragmatist, tinkered with the broken motor. Cody, the talker, told stories that made Anna laugh, a quiet, rusty sound. Frank found himself watching her. She was resilient, capable, and keeping them all alive. That afternoon, Cody commented on the stew as Anna served them another round. "I don't know what we'd do without this," he said. "You must have a freezer full of moose meat." Anna just smiled. "The cold preserves things well," she said, her answer simple and vague. It wasn't sinister, just a fact of life in the bush. In this place, nothing was normal, so everything seemed normal. On the third day, the storm lessened, but the snow was too deep to leave. Gunnar was getting close to fixing the motor, but was missing a specific tool to finish the job. "I need a small file. Anything," he grumbled. "My father had a workshop in the shed out back," Anna offered helpfully. "He kept all his tools there." "I'm sure you can find one." Grateful for the lead, Gunnar and Frank bundled up and pushed their way through the heavy snow toward the small shed half buried in a drift. The homely feeling of the cabin, the warmth of the fire, it had lulled them into a sense of security. They were just two guys going to find a tool. Gunnar pulled the heavy shed door open. The air that hit them was a dead, still cold, thick with the smell of iron and ice. Inside, hanging from the rafters like sides of game, were two human bodies. They were frozen solid, expertly butchered and stored. Frank's mind went completely blank. He saw a pile of discarded clothes in the corner, a man's heavy flannel shirt, a woman's wool coat. His gaze drifted to the neat stacks of preserved meat on a nearby shelf. The stew, the rich, savory stew he had been eating for 2 days. He doubled over in the snow, his stomach heaving. They stumbled back to the cabin in a fog of horror. The sight of the warm, cozy room was sickening. Cody was sitting by the fire, laughing, a fresh bowl of stew in his lap. Anna was humming softly, stoking the flames. The picture-perfect scene was now a nightmare. Frank snapped. "Don't eat that!" he yelled, his voice cracking as he slapped the bowl from Cody's hands. "What the hell, Frank?" Cody shouted. "It's them!" "It's her parents," Frank screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Anna. "I found the shed!" "She butchered them." The cabin fell into a terrifying silence. Anna's face, which had been a mask of quiet hospitality, went blank. In that split second, the frail, helpless girl vanished, replaced by something else entirely, a cornered animal. As Frank, blind with rage and disgust, lunged toward her, she moved with shocking speed, her hand darting for a large skinning knife on the table. She never made it. Gunnar, reacting with pure, brutal instinct, grabbed the heavy cast-iron pot from the stove and swung it. It connected with the side of her head with a sickening, dull thud. She crumpled to the floor, unconscious. But Frank wasn't done. The horror had broken something inside him. With a raw, animalistic scream, he rushed over to the girl's unconscious body, his hands closing around her throat. Gunnar grabbed him, his powerful arms locking around Frank's chest and hauling him off. "Stop it!" Gunnar yelled, shaking him hard. "She's down. We have to get the hell out of here before any other people like her get here." The words cut through Frank's rage. They grabbed their gear and ran from the cabin, leaving the girl on the floor, the spilled stew steaming beside her. The roar of the engine was a desperate, ugly sound in the clean, cold air. They fled, pushing the boat as fast as it would go, not once looking back, their minds filled with the taste of the soup and the sound of the iron pot. The real wilderness isn't the miles of snow and ice. It's the uncharted territory behind a stranger's eyes. How close have you stood to it and never even known?